Hello, I'm really sorry I can't be with you today, but I'm nonetheless delighted that I have this opportunity to share with you my thoughts on the well-being of young people and how to maximize their flourishing in the 21st century. I'm a neuroscientist, so inevitably my starting point is with the brain. And the exciting part about the human brain is really what makes me both worried and at the same time hopeful for the next century, and that is the exquisite ability of the human brain to adapt to the environment. Here you can see what the human brain looks like in the first 2 years of life. The blobby bits of the brain cells, but the distinguishing feature that characterizes the growth of the brain after birth are not the brain cells themselves, but the connections between them. Now this means that even if you're a clone, that's to say an identical twin, you're going to have a unique brain. The uniqueness will come in the pattern of the configurations of the connections between these cells. Why will it be unique? Because you're going to have unique experience. And even compared to your twin, no one is going to live your life and have exactly your experiences and therefore your memories. And in turn, these memories and experiences are going to embed themselves in your neuronal connections. And indeed, the word plastikos comes from the Greek to mold. What we're going to see is how, in even a rat brain, experience can literally leave its mark. Now here you see what's called an enriched environment. And enrichment for a rat doesn't mean to say they come to exciting meetings or they network and make new friends and exchange ideas. For a rat, all you have to do is to introduce them to a highly exploratory, stimulating environment, and rats being what they are, they will start interacting with all the objects and wheels and little branches. And you see how happy those rats look. I like to think the one on the bottom right looks particularly happy, as though he's smiling. Now, if you look at a brain cell from these kinds of experiments in animals from a simple home cage compared to these rats, let's look and see if we can see any difference. Okay, so for those of you who aren't familiar with brain cells, the blobby bit towards the bottom in the center is the main part of the cell. But I'd like you to focus on the branches and compare those branches with a brain cell from an animal who was in an enriched environment. Hopefully, what you can see are the branches are more extensive. Now, why has this happened, and why should it be interesting or important? Well, everyone, of course, is familiar with when you exercise, your muscle groups become stronger and larger, and if you don't exercise, the respective muscle groups become weaker and they tend to atrophy. You use it or you lose it. And the same is true of the brain. The more you can exercise brain cells, so they too will grow. But the way they grow is to grow branches. So what's happened is if you make brain cells work harder by putting them into an interactive, stimulating environment, they will respond eventually by growing, as you can see, more branches. But why is that so interesting or important? Well, if you have more branches, you have a greater surface area. And that means there's more space available for any other brain cell to now converge and make a connection with you. So let's just recap. A stimulating environment that makes brain cells work hard, makes them grow, or rather grow branches. The more they grow branches, the better targets they are, the easier it is for them to make connections with other brain cells. So why should making connections be so important to human, as we would say, cognitive development? Let's take something very simple, like a wedding ring. Now, a wedding ring to a very small baby might seem an object of interest because it's shiny, it's gold, you can roll it, you can stick things through it, they might even try and put it in their mouths. It's an object that is of interest purely by virtue of its sensory properties. But over time, as the connections form, as you are interacting with rings, you will learn that rings are things you put on fingers. You'll learn the name rings. And as more connections form, according to the culture in which you're born, you'll learn that wedding rings are different from other rings. They're only worn on certain fingers. They have a significance that other rings do not. And then eventually, as you get older, you might have a wedding ring of your own. And that wedding ring, even though it looks very much like other people's wedding rings, even though it's just a gold shiny band, for you that might be the most important thing, not because of any extra sensory qualities it has, but because of the associations of the engagement, the wedding day, and so on. And then, if sadly one goes from such happy days through to, let's say, the divorce, again, those associations, that significance, that meaning will change. So this object might be central to your life. It might mean very positive and very negative things, whereas for a small child, it's just something you might want to put in your mouth. So the answer lies not in the ring itself, it's just a ring, but in what's happened in your brain, in the connections that's given a personalized significance that no one else has to a particular object. And the same would be true, let's say, of your mother. You can imagine you're born, in the words of the great William James, into a booming, buzzing confusion, and you'll evaluate the world, because you have no choice, in sensory terms: how sweet, how fast, how cold, how bright. But gradually, as these erstwhile abstract visual patterns and funny sounds start to get correlated, start to appear together, so they will start to have a meaning. Eventually this might be a lady's face, your mum's face, and if mum, and let's hope she does, features again and again and again in your life, so she will have a significance that other ladies do not. Whereas to other people, she'll be a generic lady, whereas for them, they have someone else who's highly personalized and highly special. So for the first thing is connections enable you to personalize the world, to go from the sensory to the cognitive. They also enable you to understand the world. So few normal adults would be scared by seeing someone like this, and this is someone dressed up as a ghost. But a very small baby, or indeed someone with dementia, would be frightened by the sight of someone looking like this. And that's because someone with few brain connections, and this applies not just to small children, but to people where the connections have atrophied, as in dementia, such people have to take the world at face value. You take something, it's strange, it's novel, it's therefore potentially life-threatening, you're confused, and you're disorientated, and you don't know how to respond to something quite so new and unprecedented. For most of us, however, with the checks and balances of our wonderful adult brains who've had all our experiences, we can interpret what we see beyond the face value. We know this is someone dressed up as a ghost. We can understand that in a way that someone unfamiliar with it, with an immature brain or a dementing brain, could not. So connections enable you not just to personalize the world around you, but to understand it, to navigate it. And finally, they also help you to think symbolically, to see one thing in terms of something else. And so here we have a candle, and this reminds me of when I used to torture my little brother when he was 3 and I was 16, and I thought it was great fun to force him to learn Shakespeare, and he would parrot off lines from Macbeth without understanding them. So he would say, tomorrow and tomorrow and tomorrow creeps in this petty pace from day to day. As someone said, that must have gone down a storm in playgroup. But anyway, it then goes on, out, out, brief candle. Life is but a poor player. Now, had you said to him, Graham, what does that actually mean, out, out, brief candle? He would probably have said something like, well, I have a candle on my birthday cake and I blow it out. He couldn't have seen it as a metaphor for death. It's only when you know that the extinction of the candle is being used as a symbol, as a parallel for the extinction of life, that you can truly appreciate and understand that Shakespeare passage. So as you go through life, what happens initially, you are the passive recipient of incoming senses. How sweet, how fast, how cold, how bright. But gradually, this one-way street enables you to build up associations and connections, so it becomes a two-way street. So instead of just saying yuck and wow, or having all these senses bombarding you, now as you navigate the world, you can make sense of it, you can understand it, things have a significance to you and you alone by virtue of your connections. So this is why the growth of connections for the human brain par excellence is so important. The nature of you, your identity, is all down to your individual brain cell connections. You have up to 100,000 connections all converging on a single brain cell. Someone said this picture looked like a golden jungle, and that was a very good image because it's kind of survival of the fittest. The hardest working brain cells will have the most connections, and this will equip you for the particular cultural, historical niche into which you yourself have been born, so that you can really adapt to your particular world. So if that is the case, if one accepts, and I think it's hard not to, that the human brain is exquisitely mandated by evolution to adapt to the environment, what will happen if the environment is changing in an unprecedented way? For example, to the so-called digital native, those who are growing up not just able to use computers, but who accept the screen technologies, both desktops, laptops, mobiles, as a lifestyle, as a way of life. Now, people often say, oh, well, are computers good or bad? And I think that's like asking, is a car good or bad? One needs to unpack the issues into the context in which it's being used. And I think what we're all concerned about here today is the context of the young brain in particular. So we're not talking about my widowed mum who's 85, whom I would love to see on Facebook, for example. We're talking about a very vulnerable, highly impressionable young brain that doesn't have stable structure of connections, what people have called crystalline intelligence, where you have a framework in which you can embed new things, where you can relate things to each other. We're talking about a much younger brain, where as things come in, they themselves will drive the new connections between brain cells and give you this particular take on the world. Now, there's various aspects to the cyber technology, and I think, again, a mistake people make is to think that you can just use a single term or think about a single issue relating to the cyber world. My own view is that this should be unpacked further into, for example, looking at social networking, looking at gaming, and looking at the use of search engines, to name but three. Let's take each of those in turn. Let's look first at social networking. As you can see, this is from Eric Sigman's work, and I don't think anyone will be surprised by this, that as electronic media have been in the ascendancy, so face-to-face interaction appears to be declining. This is borne out by reports from British Telecom that people are texting as never before. It seems there was a recent survey that this is the more popular form of communication nowadays rather than face-to-face communication. Now, let's just have a think about that. When you first talk to someone, it's not just the words. That's been estimated at only about 10% of the impact you're going to have. It's the eye contact, it's the voice tone, it's the interpretation of body language that enables you to empathize or otherwise with others. But above all, there's also physical contact. We all know if you're very upset, nothing beats someone just putting their arm around you. So what's going to happen if you're not rehearsing those skills? If you're not rehearsing eye contact, body language, voice tone, physical contact, as we've seen, you're not going to be good at those things because the brain is only good at what it practices and what it rehearses. So it may be that there's a vicious cycle set up whereby younger people feel it rather aversive and unpleasant to talk face-to-face. And let's be honest, it's challenging enough anyway. But if you're not equipped with the appropriate skills, if you can't empathize with others, then you are going to retreat surely to the more sanitized medium of the screen technologies where you're not put on the spot. How often do we see this kind of phenomena where these three young people are not interacting with each other at all? They're in some other place. They're in some cyberspace. They're not engaging with each other in any way. Now, of course, some people might say that's just fine, and I think we should not necessarily rush into value judgments, but we should at least discuss it. Is this the kind of society, is this the kind of means of communication that we would like people to have? As you can see here, the texting is really on the rise, more popular than talking, and I think this leads to a whole range of issues relating, first of all, to empathy with others. And it's quite interesting that people with autistic spectrum disorder, that's to say people who sadly have impairments in empathy, are particularly comfortable with the screen technologies. It also raises questions as to your actual identity, how you see yourself. Is identity now dependent on constant feedback to and from everyone else flashed up on the screen with their thumbs up or their thumbs down, telling you whether they approve or not? Hasty, fast decisions where there's no inner strength, if you like, inner core identity, because the identity is constructed by the views of others on a moment-to-moment timescale. But as well as the scientific evidence, I think we shouldn't ignore the views of teachers. And you can see this very recent survey that I'm sure most of you saw in the media, showing in a survey of 400 teachers, about 3/4 of them recorded deficits in attention span that they attributed in part to too much screen time and not enough being read to time. And I think this highlights something very interesting, because when you read to a child, first of all, you're actually enhancing attention span because they're needing to concentrate, because there's a beginning, a middle, and an end. If you think about it, a raw feeling is just in the moment, whereas a thought always has a beginning, a middle, and an end, whether it's a grievance, a hope, a memory, a rational argument. There's always a sequence you follow. And I think that by reading, by having stories where there's a fixed sequence, this actually helps the thought process because it enables you to have a long enough attention span to go, if A equals B, then B equals C, then A equals C, and so on. It also brings about imagination. It's always fascinated me how when one reads a story, how you can imagine these shadowy personas of the characters. You can't necessarily say what they look like, but if you then see the film, you feel kind of let down at somebody else's second-hand imagination of them. I remember actually saying this to John Humphreys when I finally saw what he looked like. I said I felt a bit let down because I'd imagined he was very different, having heard him all the time on the Today programme. So reading a story to children surely is a way of enhancing imagination, bringing about a strong attention span, enabling the thought process to unfold, as well as giving insights, of course, into how other people behave and having empathy with how they might behave. And, of course, the physical contact of being cuddled by your mum or your dad surely has to be a good thing as well. And how very sad it is if this very valuable experience that seems to obviously give huge rewards, as well as respect for books and respect for learning, how sad if that is on the decline. As well as how one learns, there is the issue of the effects of the screen experience itself on how you are behaving. And if we are worried about attention spans and the possible decline because of lack of reading, then in this push-pull phenomena, one could think about video games at the same time shortening attention spans. There has, as I'm sure most of you are aware, been an alarming increase for prescriptions for drug for attention deficit disorder. Here you can see the increasing numbers for prescriptions for methylphenidate, one of the trade names of which is Ritalin, for attentional problems. Now, it could be doctors are prescribing more liberally, or it could be that the condition is being more recognized, or it could just be that if you take a young brain with the evolutionary mandate to adapt to the environment, and you place that young brain in an environment where they are subjected to a fast flood of bright and fast-moving and noisy images on the screen, and they have to be that, because how else would they outcompete the real world? If you're subjecting someone to super fast, super bright, super noisy, super immediate interactive experiences, of course, the brain will obligingly adapt to that, and might it not be the case that the consequence will be a shorter attention span? Now, what's very interesting is that some recent studies have shown there is indeed a bidirectionality between video games and attentional problems and impulsivity. And I think, therefore, this is another link and something we should explore, which is why it is so appealing. And part of the appeal might be the excitement and the arousal. But it does have a longer-term consequence. This is a study that came out in a peer-reviewed science journal a year or so ago, and the title speaks for itself. What they looked at were young people who were spending a long time in front of the screen, admittedly, but over some 18 months to 2 years, they looked at their brain scans and found there was a very high correlation, a rather scary 0.7 coefficient of correlation, which is very significant, between microstructural abnormalities in the brain and months of internet addiction. So I think we have to be very careful. It's not that every person is going to be addicted, every person is going to spend all their waking time on computers. But if there is the potential for experiences that seem to be increasingly enticing for long periods of time for people to do this, it's something surely that we should think about. And we can look at further brain scan data. This featured in the Daily Telegraph recently, but again from a peer-reviewed paper, showing that the children that were playing video games had brain scans that were similar to that of compulsive gamblers. And the crucial issue, bottom right, I hope you can see on the brain itself, that blob, is an enlargement of an area that, in both cases, for both gamblers and internet users, compulsive users, would be releasing more of a chemical in the brain. Now, this area of the brain and the chemical it releases is closely related to what we see with drugs of addiction. It's a chemical called dopamine, and we know that dopamine does many jobs in the brain, but among them we know it is released with all psychoactive drugs of abuse, irrespective of how they primarily work. We also know that dopamine is linked to high excitement and arousal, and we know that it's also linked to reward systems. On the whole, excitement can be very rewarding. Now, what does dopamine do in the brain in this particular instance? Well, one of the things it does is to inhibit an important part of the brain called the prefrontal cortex. This is an interesting area because in evolutionary terms it's very new. Although it occupies 33% of the human brain, it's only 17% in chimps, and anyone who likes cats, it's only 3% in cats. So we can see that it's a very new area that's not therefore responsible for the workaday functions of hearing or vision or movement, but it does the middle bit. It does things to do with what goes on between the inputs and the outputs. My own view is it doesn't have a set function in its own right, but rather it coordinates all the brain. And in any event, whatever happens, the functions are very sophisticated. We know, for example, when there's damage to the prefrontal cortex, among other things, people are very impulsive, they're very reckless, they live in the moment. And what's very interesting is, as always, evolution will reflect individual development. And this area is only actually fully active in the late teens, early 20s. So this means that children, in any event, are in a scenario where they will be inclined to be in the moment, rather excited and aroused. But there's other people also who have an underfunctioning prefrontal cortex. And interestingly, they have nothing really in common with each other. These are people with a high body mass index, that's to say, people who are heavy compared to their height, as well as compulsive gamblers, and as well as schizophrenics. Now, this conference is not about schizophrenia, but suffice it to say there's certain parallels with childhood and schizophrenia. In both cases, they're easily distracted. In both cases, schizophrenics, as with children, can't interpret proverbs. So rather like my little brother couldn't interpret the real meaning of out, out, brief candle, a schizophrenic, if you say to them, what does it mean people who live in glass houses mustn't throw stones? They'll say something like, well, if your house is made of glass and I throw a stone, your house will break, which of course is true, but they're kind of missing the point. So this ability to think metaphorically, to see one thing in terms of something else, to not take the word literally is a feature of both children and schizophrenic, as is therefore taking the world at face value. In the case of schizophrenics, they feel very imploded by strong sensations, and children, of course, are distracted by the novelty of whatever's bright or fast or sweet or whatever. So we can put this together and think, now, what is there in common between not just children and schizophrenics, between obese people and gamblers? Well, anyone who eats knows the consequence of eating. But for obese people, the thrill of the food, the taste of the food, trumps the consequences. Anyone who gambles knows the consequences of gambling. But for compulsive gamblers, the thrill of the dice being rolled or the horse past the finishing post, that experience trumps the consequences you're going to lose your money. What could this have in common with schizophrenia? Well, if we look at a series of paintings by a schizophrenic, very famous, you can see top left, everyone would recognize this as a cat. By the time we get to bottom right, I would defy anyone to say that that was a cat. But this, nonetheless, can provide us a clue, I think, that links schizophrenia and children and gambling and overeating. And we know that, incidentally, obese people are more reckless in gambling tasks. What's linking them all, as well as their underfunctioning prefrontal cortex, is the thrill of the senses trumping the consequences. It's the here and now trumping the cognitive. So we can put that together if we're trying to understand perhaps the appeal of video games. You can imagine that intense stimulation of the screen will mandate a fast response because it has to. That's what video games are all about. And then this will lead to excitement and high levels of dopamine will be released. And then this will underlie reward-seeking addictive behaviour because we know that dopamine underlies the pathways of reward and also simulates, finally, the final common path of all addictive drugs. This will lead to more dopamine being released. This, in turn, will lead to an inhibition of the prefrontal cortex, which in turn will bring about mindsets or scenarios rather similar to obesity and schizophrenia in childhood, where you crave sensation over cognition. And so what will you do? You'll therefore look for situations that give you strong sensory stimulation rather than deep thought. Where will you find it? Guess where? At the screen. And so I would suggest that this is a cycle of events that could nonetheless be related to what we're learning about the brain, or what we know about the brain, and that should be explored further. So clearly one could explore more about screen technologies, such as how one processes information, how one differentiates it from true knowledge, and how search engines, although they deliver only isolated facts, are not necessarily delivering understanding. Again, this joining up of the dots that enables you to see one thing in terms of something else, to develop a conceptual framework. So where are we now? I've often drawn comparisons between the kind of issues we've just briefly touched on today with climate change. What do we know about climate change? Well, it unpacks into lots of different questions, whether it's carbon sequestration or water shortages or alternative energy. We know it's global. We know that it's controversial. Some people think we're doomed. Other people think that science can help. Some people think, perhaps just a few, that it's exaggerated. But above all, it's unprecedented, and it's in our hands to do something. The same can apply to what we could call mind change. Again, it unpacks into lots of different questions. We've looked at one or two of them today, but one could again talk about learning and search engines, addiction and aggression, and attention spans with gaming, and identity and empathy and relationships with social networking sites. Again, it's global. Again, I would argue it's unprecedented. And again, we need to do something. It's in our hands. And of course, it's controversial. However, I think there is a huge difference between climate change and mind change. Whereas with climate change, we're effectively just putting the brakes on. With mind change, we could actually harness this technology to actually deliver the first time the best possible world for the next generation. And I think this could be done in various ways. First, I think we need more and more surveys of parents and teachers and what they really think, rather like the 400 teachers that were surveyed in terms of attention spans. Next, we need certainly epidemiology. There's certain issues that are being established, for example, at the University of Michigan, where they showed a decline in empathy over the last 10 or 30 years that could be attributable to the rise of social networking sites. But rather like with smoking and cancer, this needs to actually have robust epidemiology to go from a correlation to a causal link. Third, we need more research into basic brain mechanisms, such as those of dopamine and the prefrontal cortex, so that we can look at brain scans, both acute and longitudinally, rather like we've seen briefly in one or two of the slides today. Finally, I think we shouldn't rule out developing novel software. If we're worried about a dodgy sense of identity, if we're worried about short attention spans, if we're worried about people being reckless, perhaps, and actions not having consequences, because in video games, people can be undead quite happily. If we're worried about that, can't we devise software that actually brings about notions of consequence, notions of identity, longer attention spans? I'm sure this isn't beyond the wit of man or woman. But beyond that, we need to really remember that every hour spent in front of a screen is an hour not spent climbing a tree, not giving someone a hug, not feeling the sun on your face. So however beneficial, and there are benefits, the screen technologies turn out to be, however fancy and remedial and helpful the software, we must remember that it is two-dimensional, and on the whole, it is only stimulating two senses. It demands attention, whereas a tree doesn't ask to be climbed, a sketch pad doesn't ask you to draw in it, a path doesn't ask you to walk along it. You're the proactive one. You're the one that's actually devising and initiating the action, and I think that helps you have a strong sense of identity. And in that sense, I think our job now is to try and shape ways where the environment, this three-dimensional environment, where the person is the proactive one, could outcompete just being the passive recipient of an onslaught of the senses. We need to think of doing that. It's not good enough, to my mind, to just police how many hours a child should spend in front of a screen. As an ex-smoker, I know only too well, telling someone they mustn't do something without giving them a substitute is not very constructive. What we need is not so much rules and policing, but to devise an environment that's so attractive anyway that a young person would naturally be attracted to do it, would naturally want to do it. That's a tough call, but I think the benefits would be huge, because for the first time ever in our privileged Western world, we have a life expectancy where many of the next generation will live to be 100. So what are they going to do with their lives? Are they going to sit there as glassy-eyed zombies playing computer games where the means is an end in itself? Or can we reclaim these very powerful and formidable and potentially very useful technologies once again to be a means, not an end. The question is, what will the end be? And this is perhaps what we're all here for today to discuss and to shape, which is how to really maximize the technologies and the time and the space that it has given us to live long and healthy lives, to maximize the chance of stretching ourselves to our true potential as never before.